A low winter sun bleeds across the Bay of Naples. The sea is calm, almost glass, but the air hums with the weight of old ghosts. On the pier, a man stands alone, wrapped in a heavy overcoat, cigarette trembling between his fingers. His hair has silvered, his face marked by the slow erosion of power and years. Once, they called him Lucky Luciano, the man who built the American Mafia, the king of the underworld, the visionary who turned chaos into empire. But now, his eyes drift toward the horizon like someone watching the final credits of a film he no longer recognizes. In the shadows behind him, memories move, faces of friends, enemies, and one man in particular, the friend who would end it all. The story begins not in glory but in exile. The cobblestones of Naples carry the echo of a man stripped of his kingdom. He walks among fishermen and market sellers who have no idea who he once was. To them, he's just another aging immigrant. But inside, the storm still rages, every step haunted by the same thought: who betrayed me, and why? His past stretches across 2 continents, from the dirty alleys of Manhattan's Lower East Side to the marble floors of penthouses and courtrooms that would one day spell his ruin. Each memory is a scene in a film that will never fade. As Luciano lights another cigarette, his hands tremble slightly. He remembers the first time he saw America, a place of promise, opportunity, and deception. The young Salvatore Lucania had arrived from Sicily believing in freedom, but what he found was hunger, poverty, and the cruelty of survival. The old world had given him pride, but the new world demanded power. And power, as he would learn, was built on the backs of loyalty and lies. The same lies that would one day bring him to this very pier, alone, exiled, waiting for a meeting that might end his life. The night before his death, Luciano told a close associate something strange. "There's no loyalty left," he said quietly. "Not in America, not in Sicily. The only thing a man can trust is the silence of the dead." It wasn't bitterness, it was truth. He had seen men he'd raised like brothers sell him for a lighter sentence. He'd watched alliances turn into graves. Every betrayal was another thread in the tapestry of his empire, an empire built on shadows. Yet somehow, the final betrayal still stunned him. It wasn't an enemy who ended his reign. It was someone he once trusted more than blood. To understand that moment, the betrayal, the collapse, the myth of Lucky Luciano, we must descend into the world he created. A world of jazz and blood, cigars and gunpowder, whiskey and whispers. A world where charm was a weapon, and loyalty was a ticking bomb. This is not just the story of a gangster. It's the anatomy of power, how it's gained, how it corrupts, and how it finally consumes even its greatest architect. The air around the harbor thickens as Luciano waits for his contact. Somewhere in the crowd, a man watches, unseen, calculating. The city seems to hold its breath. The sound of church bells drifts from a distance, colliding with the noise of seagulls and taxi horns. It's an ordinary day for Naples, but for Lucky Luciano, it's the end of an empire disguised as routine. The man who once commanded armies of criminals now stands like a relic, an emperor without a throne, haunted by his own creation. Every king falls. But Lucky's fall wasn't from a bullet or betrayal in an alley. It came wrapped in a handshake, a friendly voice, a promise of one last deal. History will call it coincidence, but Luciano knew better. In the Mafia, nothing is coincidence. Every favor has a price. Every friend has a motive. And every legacy ends the same way, with silence. This story begins in that silence, the stillness before the storm. Before betrayal had a name. Before the friend who ended it all stepped out of the shadows. Before the myth became a man again, standing at the edge of the sea, listening to the ghosts whispering his true name, Salvatore Lucania. The man who built the Mafia, and was destroyed by the very code that made him king. The story of Lucky Luciano does not begin in the luxury of nightclubs or the smoky backrooms of Manhattan, it begins in hunger. It begins in the soot-covered tenements of the Lower East Side, where every child fought for space, food, and survival. The year was 1906, and America was not yet the dream it promised. The docks stank of fish and sweat, the air thick with coal smoke. Immigrants from Sicily, Ireland, and Poland slept side by side in rooms no larger than a closet. Among them was a boy named Salvatore Lucania, barely 9 years old, with a sharp gaze that already understood what adults could not, that the American dream was not given, it was taken. The streets were classrooms of cruelty. Every corner was ruled by gangs of boys with fists like stones and hearts like steel. Young Salvatore learned quickly that charm could be as powerful as violence. When other kids fought, he watched, calculating, patient. He learned who led, who followed, and who could be used. These were lessons that no school could teach. He started running errands for neighborhood gangs, delivering messages, watching deals being made in whispers. It was here, among street peddlers and thieves, that the first seeds of Lucky Luciano were planted. At night, his mother prayed for his soul in Sicilian, her rosary beads glinting in the candlelight. His father, Antonio, worked long hours at a sulfur plant and came home silent, tired, and disappointed. They had crossed an ocean for a better life, yet their son was slipping into the underworld of the American city. But Salvatore didn't see sin in what he did, he saw order. In a world where poverty ruled and laws protected only the rich, crime seemed like a business that made sense. It was efficiency born from desperation. By the age of 14, Luciano was already a name whispered among the street gangs of the Bowery. He wasn't the biggest or the strongest, but he was the smartest. He had an instinct for survival, a magnetic confidence that made others follow him without question. And more than anything, he understood people, their greed, their pride, their weakness. He knew how to turn enemies into allies, and allies into stepping stones. He began collecting small insurance payments from Jewish pushcart vendors, promising protection from other gangs. It was extortion, but done with charm. He never threatened, he smiled. That smile would one day control cities. Around this time, fate introduced him to Meyer Lansky, another immigrant boy, quiet, strategic, Jewish, and just as hungry for power. The two could not have been more different in origin, but identical in ambition. Where Luciano had charisma and brutality, Lansky had calculation and vision. Together, they became an unstoppable force, shaping the very concept of organized crime. But back then, they were just street kids with empty pockets and full hearts, dreaming of control in a world that offered them none. Luciano's teenage years were filled with arrests, petty theft, gambling, and assault, each time a reminder that he lived by a different code. Police called him a menace, but he saw himself as an entrepreneur. Jail didn't scare him, failure did. He once told a cellmate, if you want to be somebody, you gotta make the law work for you, not against you. It was a philosophy he carried his entire life, the belief that crime could be systemized, made clean, predictable, and profitable. To him, morality was irrelevant. The only sin was losing. The First World War came and went, leaving the city raw and restless. The streets filled with soldiers, hustlers, and lost souls. Opportunity was everywhere for men who could read chaos like a map. Luciano had already built small networks, gambling, prostitution, protection, all feeding into his growing reputation. He dressed better, talked smoother, and started calling himself Charlie instead of Salvatore, blending in with Americans who once mocked his accent. The nickname, Lucky, came later. Some said it was because he survived a brutal beating that left scars on his face, others said it was because he always landed on his feet. Either way, the name fit like a crown waiting for a kingdom. But power was still distant. Above him were the Italian bosses, the old-world men who still followed Sicilian rules of loyalty and blood. They distrusted Luciano's modern ideas, his friendship with Jews and Irishmen, his talk of cooperation instead of vendetta. To them, he was reckless. To Luciano, they were relics. He understood something they didn't: America was not Sicily. In America, success wasn't inherited, it was engineered. And he intended to engineer an empire. By the early 1920s, the world itself was changing. The 18th Amendment had outlawed alcohol, and overnight, liquor became the most profitable commodity in history. The underworld shifted like tectonic plates. A new generation of criminals saw what the old guard couldn't, that bootlegging was the key to real wealth. For Luciano, it was the turning point. The lessons of poverty and hunger had prepared him for this exact moment. While others fought for scraps, he saw opportunity in every barrel of forbidden whiskey. He began working with rising stars like Arnold Rothstein, a mentor who would teach him that the true power of crime lay not in violence, but in organization. The boy from the Lower East Side was no longer just another gangster. He was becoming something different, something America had never seen before, a businessman in the language of crime. Every deal, every handshake, every betrayal began shaping the man who would one day rule New York's underworld. But even as he rose, the streets never left him. In every tailored suit, every expensive cigar, there remained the memory of a starving child watching the world from a tenement window, vowing that he would never be powerless again. And it was this hunger, not greed, not evil, that made Lucky Luciano unstoppable. Yet, as history would prove, the same hunger that builds empires can also burn them to the ground. The 1920s were America's great masquerade, a nation dancing to the rhythm of jazz, drinking in secret, and pretending that the law was just another obstacle to be paid off. Prohibition had turned the entire country into a marketplace for crime, and for men like Lucky Luciano, it was paradise disguised as chaos. The world was roaring, reckless, and rich with opportunity. Every speakeasy was a kingdom, every shipment of whiskey a war waiting to happen. And in the middle of this carnival of vice, a young Luciano was preparing to change the rules forever. He was no longer the street boy from the Lower East Side, now he wore fine suits, smoked Cuban cigars, and moved through nightclubs like a man who already owned the city. But power, for him, wasn't about showing off, it was about control. While other gangsters fought over neighborhoods, Luciano thought bigger. He saw the entire criminal underworld as a fragmented corporation, one that needed a leader, structure, and vision. To him, the mafia was a broken machine with too many egos and not enough efficiency. And he was going to fix it. The engine of that vision was prohibition. When the Volstead Act made alcohol illegal, America didn't stop drinking, it just started paying more. Smugglers, bootleggers, and corrupt cops became the backbone of a billion-dollar black market. Luciano, always a strategist, realized that violence was bad for business. He began partnering with other ethnic gangs, the Irish, the Jews, even rival Italians, forming alliances that were unthinkable to the old Sicilian bosses. The traditional mafia hated it. But Luciano wasn't interested in tradition, he was interested in results. His partnership with Meyer Lansky and Benjamin Bugsy Siegel became legendary. Lansky brought brains, a cool, mathematical genius who could turn chaos into balance sheets. Siegel brought fear, a charming psychopath who could make anyone disappear with a smile. Together, they created a triangle of power that bridged every major criminal operation in New York. Luciano supplied the vision, Lansky the management, Siegel the enforcement. It was the birth of organized crime as business, not brutality. By 1925, Luciano had become one of the most influential figures in Manhattan's underworld, though few outside that world even knew his name. He kept his profile low but his connections deep. He controlled speakeasies, brothels, and supply routes stretching from Canada to Cuba. He paid off police captains, judges, even senators, not out of fear, but investment. He was transforming crime into an institution, where bribery replaced bullets and alliances replaced blood feuds. The newspapers still wrote about gang wars, but Luciano was already thinking like a corporate CEO. At the center of this transformation stood Arnold Rothstein, the so-called king of the Roaring Twenties. Rothstein was a gambler, fixer, and financier, the man who had allegedly rigged the 1919 World Series. To Luciano, he was more than a mentor, he was a blueprint. Rothstein taught him that real power was invisible. You didn't have to pull the trigger to win, you just had to own the man who did. Luciano absorbed every lesson: how to launder money through legitimate businesses, how to manipulate politicians, and most importantly, how to think like a king while acting like a servant. Under Rothstein's guidance, Luciano refined his philosophy: there's no such thing as good money or bad money, only fast money. It was this ruthlessly pragmatic mindset that would define his empire. He began to distance himself from petty criminals and surrounded himself with educated accountants, lawyers, and businessmen. While other gangsters still fought over corners and saloons, Luciano was orchestrating entire supply networks across states. Every shipment of liquor, every nightclub owner, every police officer on the take, all became parts of a vast, silent machine with him at its core. But even as his empire expanded, Luciano never lost his humanity, or at least, the version of it that fit his world. He could be generous to the poor, respectful to his elders, and protective of his family. He funded community projects in Little Italy, paid for funerals of fallen associates, and gave money to struggling families. It was not kindness, it was strategy. He understood that loyalty was bought, not born, and that fear alone couldn't hold an empire together. He ruled not just through intimidation, but through admiration. Men followed him because they wanted to, not because they had to. At least, that's what they believed. The 1920s were also a time of contradiction. America was building skyscrapers while burying bodies in concrete. Jazz clubs glowed with laughter while blood washed the sidewalks outside. And somewhere between the two worlds stood Lucky Luciano, a man of refinement and ruthlessness, a paradox in pinstripes. When he walked into a room, silence followed. He didn't need to raise his voice or show his gun. Power radiated from him like heat, the kind of power that came not from violence, but from the knowledge that everyone owed you something. As his influence grew, Luciano began dreaming of something no gangster had ever dared imagine: a unified criminal empire without chaos. He envisioned a modern mafia, built on cooperation, profit, and discipline. No more endless wars between Italian families. No more reckless street killings drawing police attention. He wanted efficiency, peace through profit. It was a revolutionary idea, and it would make him both immortal and doomed. By the decade's end, Luciano's rise was unstoppable. The death of his mentor, Arnold Rothstein, in 1928 left a void that he quickly filled. The streets were evolving, and so was he. Behind his polite smile and impeccable manners, he was quietly planning a coup against the old mafia bosses who still clung to Sicilian codes. He respected the past but didn't want to live in it. The old world worshipped loyalty, Luciano worshipped results. And soon, that belief would ignite one of the bloodiest transformations in the history of organized crime. The boy who once begged for coins on Delancey Street now moved through the city like a prince of shadows, charming, brilliant, and utterly fearless. Every lesson of his youth, every betrayal, every beating, every hungry night, had turned him into the architect of America's criminal future. But what he didn't yet know was that for every empire built, there's always a crack waiting to spread. And sometimes, that crack begins in the heart of a friend. By the dawn of the 1930s, the streets of New York were slick with ambition and blood. The old mafia was crumbling under the weight of its own traditions, and Lucky Luciano stood at the center of its collapse, both executioner and architect. The city had changed, and so had crime. Bootlegging had turned street thugs into millionaires, and alliances once bound by Sicilian honor were dissolving into greed and paranoia. The old world dons, men like Joe, the Boss, Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano, still ruled with superstition and fear. But to Luciano, they were relics of a past too small for the empire he envisioned. He was done bowing to men who couldn't see beyond bloodlines. It was time for a new order, and to create it, he would have to destroy the old one. The mafia in the early 1930s was a war zone. Two great powers, Masuria's gang and Maranzano's faction, were locked in what came to be known as the Castellammarese War, named after the Sicilian town from which Maranzano's men hailed. For years, New York's underworld had been divided along ethnic and regional lines, Neapolitans versus Sicilians, Italians versus Jews, tradition versus innovation. To the public, it was just another gang war. But to Luciano, it was an opportunity, a bloody chessboard on which he could become king. Luciano had been serving under Joe Masuria, a coarse, superstitious man who saw himself as the godfather of all Italian crime in America. Masuria believed in control through fear, bullets, oaths, and loyalty sealed in blood. But Luciano found his leadership primitive. He once joked to Meyer Lansky, "Joe still thinks we're in Palermo with knives under our coats." Luciano's vision was American, modern, organized, efficient. He wanted business, not endless vendettas. And so, while Masuria demanded loyalty, Luciano quietly plotted evolution. Masuria's paranoia grew as he sensed the winds shifting. He trusted no one, not even Luciano, his own protégé. Meanwhile, Luciano played both sides. He began secret talks with Maranzano, offering to switch allegiance if it meant peace, and a future free from the old guard. Maranzano, shrewd and aristocratic, recognized Luciano's intelligence but underestimated his ambition. The two men shared a temporary understanding: remove Masuria, end the war, and rebuild the mafia into something stronger. What Maranzano didn't realize was that Luciano had no intention of serving anyone ever again. On a cool spring afternoon in 1931, the underworld shifted forever. Luciano arranged a meeting with Joe Masuria at Nuova Villa Tomorrow, a quiet Coney Island restaurant known for its pasta and discretion. The atmosphere was deceptively calm. Masuria, wearing his favorite pinstripe suit, ate lunch and played cards while Luciano smiled politely across the table. After a few hands, Luciano excused himself to the bathroom. Moments later, the door burst open, and gunfire filled the room. Four men, Bugsy Siegel, Vito Genovese, Albert Anastasia, and Joe Adonis, stormed in and riddled Masuria's body with bullets. When Luciano returned, he found his mentor slumped over the table, cards scattered, wine spilled like blood. The old boss was gone. The new era had begun. The Masuria assassination wasn't just a murder, it was a declaration. Luciano had done what no one else dared: he killed tradition itself. The act shocked the old Sicilian mobsters, who viewed betrayal of one's boss as unforgivable. But Luciano saw it differently. In his mind, it wasn't betrayal, it was progress. To him, loyalty to a man could not outweigh loyalty to the future. That philosophy, ruthless but visionary, would define every step of his empire. With Masuria dead, Maranzano emerged victorious, declaring himself the new capo di tutti capi, boss of all bosses. He began restructuring the mafia under Roman-style hierarchy, complete with ranks like soldiers, capos, and consigliere. On paper, it seemed like exactly what Luciano had wanted: order out of chaos. But almost immediately, the cracks appeared. Maranzano, though intelligent, was obsessed with power. He surrounded himself with bodyguards, demanded tributes from every family, and spoke of purging young upstarts like Luciano. He saw the younger generation, especially Luciano and his Jewish associates, as threats to his Sicilian purity. The very system Luciano dreamed of building was now being strangled by another old man who mistook fear for respect. Luciano understood that history was repeating itself. He had traded one tyrant for another. And so, once again, he planned the unthinkable. By September 1931, rumors swirled that Maranzano had ordered Luciano's assassination. His mistake was trusting the wrong people. Luciano's spies within Maranzano's ranks warned him of the plot, giving him the chance to strike first. In a bold and cinematic move, Luciano sent 4 Jewish hitmen, disguised as government agents, into Maranzano's Park Avenue office. They posed as tax investigators, flashed fake badges, and within moments, drew guns. Maranzano never stood a chance. The bullets came fast, ending the reign of the last Old World Don in America. When the smoke cleared, Luciano had done something unprecedented: he had eliminated both bosses of the old mafia world, not out of hatred, but strategy. With their deaths, he erased the concept of a single ruler. There would be no more boss of bosses. Instead, he envisioned a council, a board of directors, that would manage all mafia affairs like a corporation. This was his revolution: crime without chaos, profit without pride. The mafia, under Luciano, would no longer be ruled by tradition but by reason. The streets buzzed with rumors, admiration, and fear. Some called him a traitor, others called him a genius. The truth was more complex. Luciano was both. He had betrayed two men who trusted him, yet in doing so, he had modernized an empire. His philosophy was clear: the mafia was not about family, it was about power. Family was emotional, power was eternal. He believed emotion was weakness, and weakness was death. But in the quiet of his nights, even Luciano couldn't silence the question that lingered at the edges of his mind: had he crossed a line that could never be uncrossed? Every time he looked at the men around him, Lansky, Siegel, Costello, he wondered which of them would one day see him as obsolete. Power demanded betrayal, it was only a matter of time before it came full circle. The fall of the old guard marked Luciano's rise to absolute authority. He had become something no gangster before him had ever been, a visionary with blood on his hands and an empire in his mind. The newspapers called it the end of an era. Luciano called it the beginning of civilization. But even civilizations, he knew, are built on graves. And somewhere beneath the marble floors of his new empire, the ghosts of Joe Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano whispered a warning he refused to hear: every king builds his throne on betrayal. And every betrayal waits for its revenge. The year was 1931, and New York was breathing again, not clean air, but a new kind of order. The chaos that had once ruled the city's underworld had gone quiet, silenced by two well-placed bullets and the will of one man, Charles "Lucky" Luciano. The deaths of Joe Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano had ripped the mafia apart, but from the ashes, Luciano was already building something no one had ever dared imagine. The newspapers called him a gangster. History would call him an architect. What he created next would define the modern face of organized crime, an institution known simply as the Commission. The idea was audacious in its simplicity: crime should be governed like business. No more single, boss of all bosses, no more reckless wars over ego and bloodlines. Instead, a council of families would share power, resolve disputes, and divide territories peacefully. Luciano's genius was that he took the anarchy of crime and gave it bureaucracy. To men who had lived by instinct and superstition, he offered structure. And to the world, he offered something even more dangerous: stability. Luciano called together the most powerful crime leaders in America, men who had survived the bloody 1920s and were smart enough to recognize the future when they saw it. Around a table sat names that would become legends: Vito Genovese, his ruthless lieutenant; Frank Costello, the political diplomat; Meyer Lansky, the brain; Joe Adonis, the enforcer; and representatives from the Chicago outfit, led by Al Capone's trusted men. In that smoke-filled room, amid glasses of whiskey and murmured agreements, the mafia became a corporation. The Commission was born. The structure was elegant and deadly. Each major family, the 5 families of New York, would control its own operations but answer to the Commission for larger disputes. No more street wars, no more random killings that drew public attention. Every major decision would go through the board. Violence, like profit, would now be regulated. It was a democracy of crime, and Luciano sat quietly at its center, the unspoken chairman. He didn't need the title of boss of bosses. He had created a system where everyone depended on him anyway. True power, he realized, didn't shout, it whispered. Under this new order, the mafia thrived like never before. Bootlegging, prostitution, gambling, narcotics, all flowed through well-organized channels. Luciano demanded that families focus on profit, not pride. He punished those who killed unnecessarily or brought media attention. He rewarded those who played smart. For the first time in criminal history, the mafia functioned like a multinational business. Every city had its franchise, every boss his shareholders. The Code of Omerta, the sacred vow of silence, was its unbreakable contract. Breaking it wasn't just betrayal, it was treason. But beyond the mechanics of power, Luciano's brilliance lay in psychology. He understood that men were not machines, they were driven by fear, respect, and desire. The commission balanced those emotions perfectly. Each man felt powerful, but never safe. Each family had autonomy, but also obligation. Luciano's genius wasn't in forcing obedience, it was in making everyone believe the system worked for them. In truth, it worked for him. He didn't rule by fear alone. He ruled by necessity. Every man in that room needed the world Lucky Luciano had built. And that made him untouchable. In the background of this new structure was the code, not just Omerta, but the moral architecture that defined life in the mafia. Loyalty was absolute. Family came before everything. Business above emotion. To the outside world, it looked like barbarism dressed in fine suits. But to the men who lived it, it was almost sacred, a religion of order born from chaos. Luciano understood that even criminals needed meaning. So he gave them one. The commission wasn't just an organization, it was a myth. A brotherhood of men bound by blood, fear, and profit. The system worked. For a while. The 1930s became a golden era of organized crime. Violence dropped, profits soared, and the mafia's reach extended into politics, unions, and Hollywood. Luciano's friend Frank Costello became known as the Prime Minister of the Underworld for his deep ties with judges and senators. Meyer Lansky invested mob money into legitimate casinos in Florida and Cuba, blurring the line between crime and business. Luciano, meanwhile, became the silent emperor, the man behind every handshake and every payoff. He once said, "The world runs on business, legal or illegal. I just learned to make it all one thing." Yet, beneath the surface of peace, tension simmered. The older bosses still whispered that Luciano was too modern, too American, too trusting of outsiders. They resented his partnerships with Jewish and Irish criminals, seeing it as a betrayal of Sicilian purity. But Luciano dismissed their complaints. "Money doesn't care who earns it," he told them. "Why should we?" It was a dangerous kind of pragmatism, one that challenged centuries of tradition. He wasn't just changing the rules, he was erasing them. Luciano's authority spread beyond New York. The commission's model was exported to Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, and Los Angeles. Even the mafia in Sicily began to mirror his structure. The underworld had never been so organized, so efficient, so quietly powerful. But with that success came paranoia. Luciano knew that order in crime was an illusion, a mask over the chaos. Men like Genovese, waiting in the shadows, saw opportunity in every sign of weakness. The same system that protected Luciano also armed his rivals with a clear blueprint of how to overthrow him. Still, for the time being, Luciano stood at the pinnacle of power. His nights were spent in Harlem clubs, his days in hotel suites filled with politicians and businessmen. He had everything he had ever dreamed of: money, respect, control. But there was one thing even Lucky Luciano couldn't control: trust. Every empire, no matter how perfectly designed, depends on men. And men, he knew, were flawed. The same loyalty he demanded was built on greed and fear, the two weakest foundations of all. There's a photograph from that era, Luciano sitting at a table in the Waldorf Astoria, a half-smile on his face, smoke curling from his cigarette. Around him, his allies laugh and toast, their glasses catching the light. It looks like victory. But in his eyes, there's distance, the faint recognition that every triumph plants the seed of its own downfall. He had unified the mafia, yes, but in doing so, he had created something too big to ever truly control. The commission was both his masterpiece and his curse. For now, though, Lucky Luciano had achieved the impossible. He had turned gangsters into businessmen, assassins into partners, chaos into structure. He had built a kingdom not of thrones, but of ledgers and alliances. To the world, he was invisible, to the underworld, he was law. Yet, like every law ever written, his too would one day be broken, not by enemies, but by friends. Because in the world Luciano created, betrayal was not an exception. It was the system itself. Power, for Lucky Luciano, was never about violence, it was about precision. The blade didn't need to be swung if everyone already knew who held it. By the early 1930s, Luciano had mastered the quiet art of control. He didn't rule with the rage of Capone or the superstition of Maranzano. He ruled with logic, charm, and an understanding of human psychology so sharp it could cut through steel. To outsiders, he was a phantom, a man who appeared in the background of every major deal yet left no fingerprints. To those who knew him, he was both savior and shadow, the man who could make you rich or make you disappear, depending on how useful you were to his design. Luciano's true genius lay not in bloodshed, but in reading people. He could look at a man and know within seconds whether he was driven by greed, pride, or fear. He treated each accordingly. For the ambitious, he offered opportunity. For the proud, he offered respect. For the fearful, he offered protection, or the illusion of it. He built an empire on human instinct, manipulating emotions the way a conductor manipulates music. He didn't need loyalty enforced by gunpoint, he made loyalty profitable. Men followed him not because they were terrified, though many were, but because their futures seemed brighter under his shadow. Luciano also understood appearances. He didn't bark orders, he asked questions. He didn't threaten, he suggested. When he gave commands, they sounded like favors. "Take care of this, would you?" he'd say softly, a cigarette between his lips, his tone almost friendly. But everyone in the room understood, refusal was not an option. That subtlety was his weapon. His power was invisible yet absolute, and it terrified his rivals more than any bullet ever could. To be summoned by Lucky Luciano was to stand before the invisible hand that moved New York itself. He lived by a code of efficiency, not emotion. Everything had a purpose, every handshake, every betrayal, every death. When someone had to be eliminated, Luciano's orders were cold and mathematical. "Make it quick," he would tell his men. "No mess." He didn't enjoy violence, he saw it as a tool, like accounting or negotiation. That detachment gave him an aura of invincibility. While other gangsters burned themselves out in wars and vendettas, Luciano thrived because he understood the psychology of restraint. He once told Frank Costello, "Fear lasts longer than pain. People remember who made them scared, not who hit them." Inside his empire, he maintained balance like a chess grandmaster. Every player had a purpose, every move a counterbalance. If one capo became too ambitious, Luciano would promote a rival to keep him in check. If two families argued, he'd offer himself as mediator, always the peacemaker, always indispensable. But the peace he offered was never free. Every decision, every arbitration, increased his control. Even when he appeared neutral, the outcome always benefited him. The commission had been designed to eliminate absolute power, yet somehow, it made Luciano more powerful than any boss of bosses before him. His charm was equally legendary. In private dinners or smoky clubs, Luciano could disarm politicians, seduce socialites, and recruit killers, all within the same night. He could shift from humor to menace in a heartbeat. One minute he was laughing about baseball, the next he was reminding a senator that a vote could go missing. He treated gangsters like businessmen and businessmen like gangsters, bridging two worlds that pretended not to touch. His elegance made him acceptable to the elite, but his ruthlessness kept him king among criminals. He was, as one detective later said, a gentleman in a suit woven from fear. But control has a cost. To maintain order, Luciano had to become what he despised, paranoid. The more power he gained, the more he watched the faces around him for cracks in their smiles. He knew the world he built ran on ambition, and ambition never sleeps. Men like Vito Genovese, once his loyal lieutenant, were already dreaming of taking his place. Luciano understood the rhythm of betrayal, the way loyalty decayed with success. So he stayed ahead of it, buying time with money, favors, and manipulation. If he couldn't trust loyalty, he would engineer it. He began studying not just crime, but human behavior. He read psychology and business theory, finding eerie similarities between Wall Street executives and mob bosses. Both thrived on risk, both demanded loyalty, and both were destroyed by ego. Luciano's philosophy was that people were predictable as long as they got what they wanted. So he gave everyone something: power, money, women, safety, always keeping them dependent on him. In this, he became less a criminal and more a psychological engineer of corruption. The empire he managed extended far beyond New York. Through alliances with Lansky and Siegel, Luciano had his hand in gambling dens in Florida, smuggling routes in Cuba, narcotic shipments through Europe, and even labor unions that controlled America's docks. He had infiltrated the very arteries of the nation's economy. Ships carrying government cargo also carried his heroin. Unions that built skyscrapers also built his fortune. It wasn't just organized crime anymore, it was organized society. Yet behind the calm surface of his control, danger was brewing. Law enforcement was growing smarter, no longer chasing gunmen but accountants. Newspapers began whispering Luciano's name, calling him the CEO of crime. He brushed it off publicly, but privately he knew exposure was poison. The more visible he became, the more enemies gathered, not just in government, but within his own ranks. Control, he realized, was never permanent. It was only ever borrowed. He tried to maintain balance through ritual. Every week, he met with his closest circle, Lansky, Costello, Adonis, and Genovese. These meetings were half business, half therapy. They drank, argued, and laughed like brothers. But beneath the laughter was a silent calculus: who was gaining too much influence, who was too quiet, who was plotting their next move. Luciano often said, "You don't lose power when people hate you. You lose it when they stop pretending they love you." And lately, the love in that room felt thinner every week. Outside those circles, Luciano cultivated relationships with politicians, judges, and police officials, his invisible army. He paid them not just in cash but in information, favors, and silence. He understood that power was a conversation, and he always made sure to speak last. For years, he stayed 3 steps ahead of the law, because half the law was already in his pocket. But as he tightened his grip, the city itself began to turn against him. Newspapers wanted a villain, reformers wanted a crusade, and ambitious prosecutors wanted a trophy. And Lucky Luciano, calm and smiling, was about to become the biggest target of them all. By 1935, the invisible threads of his control stretched across America, but one tug from the wrong hand could unravel everything. He had perfected the art of power, but not even he could escape its curse. Every empire creates its own enemies, and every king must face the shadow of his crown. Luciano didn't know it yet, but the same brilliance that made him untouchable was slowly making him alone. And in the world he ruled, loneliness was the beginning of weakness. By 1935, Lucky Luciano stood at the summit of the criminal world, but he was beginning to feel the cold winds that only blow at the top. Power had brought him everything: wealth, fame, and the illusion of safety. But beneath the velvet and cigars, the foundations of his empire were shifting. The commission had made him king without a crown, yet the very system he built depended on men whose loyalty was as fragile as the glass they toasted with. Every friend he trusted had ambitions of their own. Every smile in his inner circle concealed an agenda. And somewhere in that growing darkness, one friend was already preparing to betray him, a betrayal that would echo for the rest of his life. That friend was Vito Genovese, Luciano's second-in-command, a man as cunning as he was cruel. On the surface, they were inseparable, partners in business, brothers in blood. Genovese had fought alongside Luciano during the Maranzano years, had helped him build the commission, and had stood at his right hand as the empire expanded. He called Luciano amico mio, and Luciano, perhaps blinded by his own confidence, believed him. But Genovese was not a man who could live in another's shadow. He was patient, calculating, and born with the same hunger that once fueled Luciano himself. To him, Lucky's empire wasn't a monument, it was a throne waiting to be inherited. Luciano, for all his brilliance, made the mistake every ruler makes when power becomes familiar: he trusted routine. He believed the machine he built could sustain itself without constant fear. He allowed men like Genovese to grow too powerful, too comfortable. While Luciano enjoyed the high life, fine hotels, beautiful women, and dinners with politicians, Genovese was quietly building his own network, one that ran parallel to his boss's. He courted soldiers, bribed police, and spread whispers. "Luciano's getting soft," he told them. "He's more businessman than boss." In the mafia, softness was the scent of death. Meanwhile, outside forces were stirring. The U.S. government, embarrassed by how openly crime flourished under Luciano's nose, began a full-scale campaign to destroy him. Newspapers called him the Napoleon of crime, while reformers demanded his head. And in the center of that crusade was a young, ambitious prosecutor named Thomas E. Dewey. Dewey was everything Luciano despised: self-righteous, incorruptible, and obsessed. To him, taking down Lucky Luciano wasn't just a case, it was destiny. He wanted to become the man who ended America's golden age of organized crime. Luciano, at first, laughed him off. "He's a kid with a badge," he told Costello. "Kids grow up fast," Costello warned. Luciano didn't listen. Dewey began where most investigators failed, with the women. The mob's empire of vice depended on brothels, madams, and sex workers who were often overlooked by the men they served. Dewey saw them as witnesses, not victims. One by one, he began flipping them, offering protection in exchange for testimony. Many of these women had never even met Luciano directly, but his name floated through every conversation, every transaction. Mr. Lucky, they called him, the man behind the curtain, the one who made sure everyone got paid. It didn't matter that Luciano had insulated himself from direct involvement, in the eyes of the law, his shadow was enough. As Dewey built his case, Luciano's paranoia grew. He began to suspect leaks within his own ranks. Information was slipping, locations of meetings, names of associates, even details about shipments. He accused lieutenants, fired bodyguards, and demanded silence from everyone around him. But the real threat wasn't the government's files, it was the whisper of betrayal among his own men. Genovese, ever the opportunist, fanned those flames. He told others that Luciano had lost his touch, that the boss's lavish lifestyle was drawing too much attention. "He thinks he's untouchable," Genovese murmured, "but nobody is untouchable." There was another man Luciano should have watched more closely, a friend turned reluctant enemy named Albert Anastasia, the Lord High Executioner. Anastasia commanded the mob's enforcement arm, the group later known as Murder Incorporated. He was loyal, but loyalty in his world was always conditional. Luciano had kept Anastasia close, but even he knew that power was transactional. "I'm loyal," Anastasia once said, "as long as the money keeps talking." And money, in those years, was flowing faster than ever, but so were suspicions. Luciano was surrounded by men who would die for him, and twice as many who might sell him if the price was right. The most dangerous part of this new chapter was how invisible the betrayal was. Luciano's empire was built on trust disguised as friendship. He'd learned long ago that control was easier when men wanted to obey. But that philosophy, so effective in creating the commission, became his weakness. He mistook fear for respect, dependence for loyalty. He had built a system that rewarded ambition, and now that ambition was turning inward. His closest allies, Costello, Lansky, Genovese, were beginning to see themselves not as lieutenants, but as heirs. Behind closed doors, Genovese began making quiet moves with law enforcement. He started feeding them information, just enough to deflect attention from himself, and subtly direct it toward Luciano. Some historians believe he worked through intermediaries, others that he personally leaked details about Luciano's vice operations. What's certain is that Dewey's team began receiving inside knowledge too precise to be luck. Meeting times. Safe houses. Routes. Slowly, the walls closed in. Luciano noticed the tightening net too late. He ordered lawyers, bribed judges, and shifted locations constantly, but the evidence was piling up. Dewey's case had momentum, and the press was already calling it, "The People versus Lucky Luciano." For the first time, the man who built order from chaos found himself surrounded by it. He had designed a machine that protected him from the street, but not from betrayal. One evening in his Waldorf Astoria suite, Luciano met privately with Genovese. The air was heavy, the conversation careful. "They're coming for me," Luciano said quietly. "Maybe it's time to lay low for a while." Genovese nodded sympathetically, hiding a smirk. "You've been the boss too long, Charlie. People start to get ideas. Maybe let me handle things while you disappear." Luciano looked at him for a long moment, the ghost of a smile on his lips. "Careful, Vito," he said. "Sometimes the next boss gets buried before the old one." It was half a joke, half a prophecy, and both men knew it. The betrayal wouldn't happen all at once, it would unfold like a slow poison. The witnesses Dewey found, the files that surfaced, the testimonies that seemed rehearsed, all pointed in the same direction. Someone close to Luciano was pulling the strings, quietly trading information for immunity. Years later, men in the underworld whispered that Genovese had struck a secret deal to remove Luciano and take his place. Whether or not it was true, the result was the same: the empire's foundation cracked. By 1936, the golden age of Luciano's reign was bleeding out. The press was circling, the courts were sharpening their knives, and his friends, the ones who toasted his brilliance, were already preparing to survive without him. The king of the underworld was surrounded not by soldiers, but by actors playing loyalty for as long as it benefited them. And the man who once believed he could control everyone finally learned the most brutal truth of power: you can't own people, only moments. Every empire begins with friendship, and ends with betrayal. For Lucky Luciano, that lesson was about to become personal. The friend who would end it all was already smiling across the table, waiting for his chance. And Luciano, ever the master of psychology, had no idea he was the one being studied. The war was no longer fought in alleys or speakeasies, it was fought in courtrooms, newspapers, and backrooms filled with frightened whispers. By 1936, Lucky Luciano's empire was under siege. The man who had turned crime into business now found his business on trial. And leading the charge against him was Thomas E. Dewey, a prosecutor with a face made for headlines and a moral compass sharp enough to draw blood. The old gang wars had ended, but a new kind of war had begun, one that Luciano could not win with bullets or charm. It was a war of information, betrayal, and silence. The American public was hungry for justice. They had watched gangsters live like kings through the Depression, dining in luxury while ordinary people starved. Al Capone had been caged for tax evasion, but New York's underworld still thrived: bootleggers turned nightclub owners, pimps turned businessmen. To the people, Luciano was the face of that hypocrisy, a man who walked among the elite by day and ruled the gutters by night. Dewey understood this perfectly. He didn't just want to imprison Luciano, he wanted to destroy his myth. Dewey's first move was surgical. He went after Luciano's most vulnerable operation: prostitution. The vice empire had always been a necessary evil, a business that supplied steady income and political leverage. But it was also his weakest link, full of people who could be turned: frightened women, greedy pimps, crooked cops. Dewey's investigators began raiding brothels across Manhattan, arresting hundreds of prostitutes and madams. At first, no one talked. The women feared the mafia more than prison. But Dewey played a longer game. He offered protection, anonymity, and a promise: testify, and you will live. One by one, they began to break. The testimonies painted a vast network: brothels run with military efficiency, payments funneled through intermediaries, profits sent up the chain until they reached Luciano himself. Many of the stories were exaggerated or coerced, but it didn't matter. In the court of public opinion, Lucky Luciano had become the king of vice. Dewey's narrative was simple and devastating: the man who corrupted America's law and politics was also corrupting its women. It was moral theater, and the country was watching. Inside his Waldorf Astoria suite, Luciano read the headlines with calm disdain. He had been in tight spots before. He believed money could buy anything: loyalty, silence, even justice. He instructed his lawyers to prepare, told his men to keep their mouths shut, and assured his partners that everything was under control. But beneath the surface, cracks were spreading. Informants were disappearing, witnesses were being protected, and the FBI had begun sharing intelligence with Dewey's office. For the first time, Luciano's web of influence was outmatched by a government willing to fight back using his own methods: strategy, organization, and fear. What he didn't realize was that someone inside his circle was helping Dewey. Information about safe houses, coded messages, and even internal financial ledgers began surfacing in the prosecutor's files. It wasn't coincidence, it was orchestration. Rumors whispered that Vito Genovese, ever the opportunist, had brokered secret communication with Dewey's investigators. Others suggested that lower-level associates, tired of living in fear, had flipped for protection. Either way, the law was moving faster than Luciano could react. His own brilliance, the structure, the efficiency, the documentation, was now being used as evidence against him. By spring 1936, Dewey had gathered enough material to move in. On April 1, police officers and federal agents raided a suite at the Waldorf Towers and arrested Lucky Luciano without resistance. The scene was surreal: the man who ruled New York's underworld standing calmly in a silk robe, cigarette in hand, as detectives surrounded him. "You boys must be proud," he said with a faint smile. "Just don't wrinkle the suit." It was his last gesture of control, the calm before humiliation. The arrest sent shockwaves through America. Headlines screamed, "Lucky Luciano, king of crime captured." The underworld froze. Some panicked, others celebrated. Politicians congratulated Dewey for striking a blow against corruption, while the public cheered as if a tyrant had fallen. But for those who knew Luciano, it felt impossible. He had outsmarted everyone for years. Could the man who built the commission really be undone by a handful of prostitutes and a prosecutor's ambition? Or had someone, somewhere, handed Dewey the keys? Luciano's inner circle fractured overnight. Some men fled to Cuba or Florida. Others pledged loyalty but refused to act. His consigliere, Frank Costello, began focusing on political survival. Lansky offered to move operations abroad. And Genovese, always watching, always calculating, began whispering that maybe it was time for a new leader. In the mafia, weakness was contagious. Once a boss looked vulnerable, he was already dead in spirit. Luciano, sitting in a holding cell, knew it. He had built a system where loyalty was currency, and the market had just crashed. In interrogation rooms, Dewey's team pressed for confessions. They didn't need evidence, they needed a story. The prosecutors described Luciano as a moral rot at the heart of America, a man who turned women into slaves and corrupted every institution he touched. It was theater with a purpose, to make the public hate him enough that a conviction would feel like redemption. Luciano refused to speak. "You can write whatever you want," he told reporters. "But I never forced anyone to do anything. Everybody worked for themselves." His defiance only made him more infamous. Behind bars, the silence of his friends was deafening. No one came to see him. No one risked helping. The same men who once toasted him now distanced themselves, fearing Dewey's wrath. Even politicians who once took Luciano's money now claimed they'd never met him. He was learning the oldest lesson of power: when the crown falls, the crowd disappears. And somewhere, in a room Luciano couldn't see, his betrayer was watching, satisfied that the king had finally been cornered. Dewey's case became a public spectacle. Witness after witness took the stand, spinning tales of Luciano's vast vice network. The evidence was weak, but the narrative was airtight. It didn't matter whether Luciano directly managed the brothels, the perception was enough. Dewey painted him as the spider at the center of the web, the man who turned sin into a supply chain. The courtroom became a stage, with the prosecutor as hero and Luciano as villain. Each testimony cut deeper, each headline louder. Luciano's attorneys fought valiantly, but they were fighting ghosts. Every piece of evidence, every name mentioned, seemed to lead back to him. The web he had woven so carefully, one designed to protect him through layers of intermediaries, now connected straight to his name. It was as if fate itself had flipped the board. For the first time, Lucky Luciano's intelligence, his structure, his innovation, the things that made him invincible, were the very tools that ensured his destruction. As the trial approached, Luciano began to understand something far more terrifying than prison: he was being erased. His influence, his empire, his reputation, all being rewritten by the same system he once manipulated. The law had learned from him. Dewey was using Luciano's own playbook: patience, strategy, and precision, to dismantle him piece by piece. There was no honor here, no duel of equals. It was extermination dressed in procedure. And through it all, the whispers of betrayal grew louder. Luciano didn't need proof, he could feel it. Someone close had fed the machine that now ground him down. He didn't yet know the name, but he could sense the presence. The way prosecutors seemed to know when he'd meet someone, how they anticipated every defense. It wasn't luck. It was betrayal disguised as justice. Outside, the city moved on. The nightclubs kept playing, the brothels kept running, the money kept flowing, only now, it flowed to new hands. Hands that smiled in Luciano's face just months before. The great Lucky Luciano, the master of control, was now the hunted. And the empire he had built on loyalty and silence was collapsing in whispers and paperwork. He once told a young gangster, "The smartest man in the room isn't the one who talks, it's the one who listens." But now, sitting behind the bars of the Tombs prison, he realized too late that someone had been listening all along. The hidden war was over. The government had its victory, the betrayer had his revenge, and Lucky Luciano, the man who tamed the underworld, was about to learn that even the most powerful empire can fall to the quietest whisper. The spring of 1936 bled into summer with the weight of inevitability. The newspapers had already written the ending before the trial began. Lucky Luciano, the untouchable king of organized crime, was finally caught in his own web. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse each morning, photographers flashing as the man who once ruled New York's shadows arrived in handcuffs and a tailored suit. He looked calm, immaculate, and bored, as if the entire performance were beneath him. But behind that controlled expression, Charles Lucky Luciano understood exactly what was happening. The trial wasn't about justice. It was about the dismantling of an empire, his empire, and it had been engineered from the inside. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was electric. Reporters packed the benches, stenographers raced to capture every word, and Thomas E. Dewey sat at the prosecutor's table like a conductor preparing for a symphony. Across from him, Luciano exuded an unnerving composure. He wore expensive suits, smoked elegantly, and occasionally smirked when witnesses mentioned his name. He never raised his voice, never pleaded. He knew the cameras were watching. If he was going to fall, he would fall like a king, never showing fear. Dewey's opening statement was a performance designed for history. He called Luciano, the dictator of vice, claiming that every brothel in New York operated under his authority. He is not a man, Dewey declared, but an institution of corruption. The courtroom gasped. To the jury, middle-class citizens raised on Depression-era morality, Dewey was the voice of righteousness. To Luciano, he was just another ambitious man using morality as theater. "He's selling me like a movie," Luciano whispered to his lawyer. "I should be getting royalties." The prosecution's case hinged on testimony from dozens of prostitutes and madams who claimed to have worked under Luciano's protection. Many had never met him, some described a man they only heard about in rumors. Yet each story built the same myth, that Luciano was the unseen hand behind every sin in the city. Dewey didn't need evidence. He needed symbolism, and Luciano, larger than life, gave him that effortlessly. As the witnesses took the stand, Luciano listened with a detached expression that infuriated the court. The madams described coded payments, nightly quotas, and the boss's collectors, men who claimed to work for Lucky. Dewey asked leading questions, weaving a narrative that sounded almost biblical: a fallen city, a seductive evil, a righteous crusader. The jury wasn't judging facts anymore. They were judging a story, and Luciano was its villain. But beneath the surface, something far more sinister was unfolding. Dewey's team had been handed internal documents that traced Luciano's hidden financial operations, ledgers, payments, even coded notes. None of these should have been accessible. They were kept in safe houses known only to Luciano's most trusted men. He immediately suspected what he'd feared for months: someone close to him had sold him out. The betrayal wasn't random, it was surgical. Every move Dewey made seemed preemptive, as if he already knew what defense the mafia would mount. Luciano's empire wasn't collapsing from external pressure, it was being hollowed out from within. Frank Costello and Meyer Lansky did what they could. They hired top attorneys, bribed small-time witnesses, and worked every contact they had in the press. But Dewey's narrative was unstoppable. He painted Luciano not as a gangster, but as a symbol of corruption in America's soul. Every editorial, every radio broadcast, every courtroom sketch reinforced the same image: Lucky Luciano, the man who owned sin itself. In one of the trial's most dramatic moments, a former prostitute named Siska, the Canary, Morton, took the stand. She claimed she'd overheard conversations between Luciano's collectors and brothel operators, describing him as the man who gives the orders. When asked if she'd ever seen him, she hesitated, just long enough to show doubt, but then nodded. "Once," she said softly. The courtroom gasped. Dewey paused for effect, letting her words hang in the air. It didn't matter if it was true. The image was all that counted. Luciano leaned over to his lawyer and whispered, "She never saw me in her life." The lawyer didn't respond. There was nothing to say. Dewey had built a case out of shadows, but it was airtight because it fed the public's hunger. People wanted to see a king bleed. They wanted to believe that justice could reach the untouchable. The trial dragged on for 6 weeks, every day another step toward an ending everyone could feel but no one dared to name. As testimony mounted, Luciano's defense tried to dismantle Dewey's story. They argued there was no direct link between Luciano and the brothels, that he had left street operations years ago to focus on business ventures. But the jury didn't care about business. They cared about morality. Dewey had turned the courtroom into a confessional, and Luciano was the devil repenting too late. At night, back in his cell, Luciano would replay every betrayal in his mind. He knew he had enemies, that was natural. But this was different. The precision of the attack, the timing, the way every one of his defenses failed simultaneously, it had the fingerprints of an inside job. He thought of Genovese, his old friend with cold eyes and colder patience. He thought of conversations, of subtle hints, of moments that suddenly made sense. Maybe it's him, he told himself. Maybe it was always him. On June 6, 1936, the jury returned after 9 hours of deliberation. The verdict was unanimous, guilty on all counts. The courtroom erupted, applause from spectators, reporters rushing to telephones, Dewey shaking hands like a victorious general. Luciano sat motionless, his face expressionless. When the judge asked if he had anything to say before sentencing, he simply shrugged. "You're the boss," he said quietly. The judge, playing to the cameras, called him a menace to civilization and sentenced him to 30 to 50 years in state prison. For a man who once controlled a nation's underworld, the fall was biblical. The newspapers compared him to Caesar, betrayed and dethroned by his own Senate. Dewey became a national hero overnight. His photo graced magazine covers, his name synonymous with law and order. For Luciano, the irony was almost poetic. He had created a system so efficient, so corporate, that even the government could now replicate it. He had turned crime into business, and Dewey had turned justice into show business. As he was led out of the courtroom, reporters shouted questions. "Lucky. How does it feel to lose?" He stopped, smiled faintly, and said, "I never lose. Sometimes I just don't win fast enough." The cameras flashed. The line would become legend, repeated in films and books for decades. But behind that bravado, Luciano felt the sting of something worse than prison: irrelevance. The empire he'd built no longer needed him. His men were already reorganizing, his partners recalculating. In his absence, others would rise, Genovese among them, and the system would go on without its architect. On the day of his transfer to Clinton Correctional Facility in Dannemora, the sky was gray, heavy with rain. As the car drove north through empty highways, Luciano stared out the window at the endless trees. Somewhere behind him, the city he built was already forgetting him. In the distance, a guard coughed and muttered, "Not so lucky now, huh?" Luciano smirked faintly. "You'll see," he said. "Luck don't die, it just changes address." In the months that followed, the underworld adapted. The commission continued to function. Money flowed. Deals were made. But everything felt different. Without Luciano's hand to steady it, the balance between greed and order began to wobble. The peace he'd enforced was unraveling. Inside his cell, Luciano received letters, some loyal, some taunting, some unsigned. The one that mattered most came from Naples, written in elegant Italian: "Even kings have friends who want their crown." It wasn't signed. But Luciano didn't need a name. The fall had begun not with bullets, but with betrayal, a betrayal that wore the face of friendship. And as the iron doors closed behind him, the man who built the American Mafia realized that every empire ends the same way: not with war, not with defeat, but with the quiet betrayal of the one person you thought would never turn on you. The summer of 1936 in New York City shimmered with a strange kind of heat, the kind that presses down on concrete, makes tempers flare, and seems to trap sound in the air. The newspapers screamed his name in bold black ink: "Lucky Luciano sentenced, King of Crime falls." The public celebrated, politicians toasted, and Thomas E. Dewey became the city's golden boy. But inside the courthouse, where marble columns stood like silent judges, Charles "Lucky" Luciano sat with a faint, unreadable smile. The trial was over. The legend, it seemed, had been brought to its knees. Yet as the courtroom emptied and the cameras clicked, Luciano knew something that no one else did: this was not the end of his empire, only the beginning of his myth. The trial had been brutal theater. Dewey's team had orchestrated it like a Hollywood production: carefully timed testimonies, emotional witnesses, sensational headlines. It wasn't just about convicting a man, it was about rewriting American morality. Luciano, who had always thrived on control, had watched helplessly as the story of his life was twisted into a parable of sin and punishment. He was the perfect villain: foreign, intelligent, charming, dangerous. The public didn't want nuance, they wanted a monster to banish. And Dewey gave them one. When the verdict came down, guilty on all counts, the courtroom erupted in applause. Even the stenographers stopped typing. Dewey, calm and triumphant, thanked the jury for their courage. Luciano sat motionless, one hand resting on his knee, his cigarette unlit. He didn't flinch, didn't argue. The photographers expected rage, they got elegance. His lawyer leaned close and whispered, we can appeal. Luciano smiled faintly. Don't bother, he said. They already made their movie. The sentencing was a spectacle of its own. The judge, relishing his moment in history, lectured Luciano for 20 minutes about morality and corruption. You have degraded the womanhood of this city, he declared, his voice echoing off the walls. You have profited from the misery of others, and you have done so without remorse. Luciano's expression never changed. When the judge announced his sentence, 30 to 50 years in state prison, there was a collective gasp. It was the longest sentence ever given to a crime boss in American history. Reporters scribbled furiously, knowing every word would sell papers. As marshals approached to escort him away, Luciano finally spoke. 30 years, 50 years, what's the difference? I can do any of it standing up. Outside the courthouse, the crowd surged. Some cheered, others jeered. The flashbulbs burst like fireworks, freezing his face in the light, confident, detached, almost regal. A reporter shouted, "Lucky, any regrets?" Luciano turned briefly, his lips curling into a half-smile. "Yeah," he said. "That I didn't charge admission." It was defiance and theater all at once, and it made him immortal. He was taken first to the Tombs, then transferred upstate to Clinton Correctional Facility in Dannemora, known as Little Siberia, for its brutal winters and isolation. The once glamorous gangster was now prisoner number 9231, sleeping on an iron cot, his name replaced by a number. The guards hated him, the inmates worshipped him. Within weeks, Luciano had turned the prison hierarchy upside down. Cigarettes, coffee, protection, everything ran through him. Even behind bars, he created order. One guard later admitted, if you wanted peace in the block, you just asked Mr. Luciano. Yet beneath that quiet dominance was rage, not at Dewey, not at the system, but at betrayal. He spent long nights pacing his cell, replaying the events that led him there. Who had given Dewey those ledgers? Who had pointed the witnesses in the right direction? The timing was too perfect, the collapse too precise. His instincts screamed the name he didn't want to admit, Vito Genovese. The man he had once called brother. The man who had sat across from him at every meeting, smiling that careful, watchful smile. Luciano had betrayed many men in his life, Joe Masuria, Salvatore Maranzano, but he had never expected to be outplayed in the same way. The irony was cruel and perfect. Genovese had, conveniently, fled to Italy just months before Luciano's trial began, escaping an unrelated murder charge. To the outside world, it looked like coincidence. To Luciano, it was confirmation. He knew what was coming, he muttered to Costello in a rare prison visit. He made his move, and I didn't see it. Costello sighed. You taught him too well, Charlie. That's the problem. The empire outside the prison didn't crumble, it evolved. Costello took over political operations. Lansky managed the money. Genovese, from abroad, whispered into the ears of those hungry for a new hierarchy. The commission survived, but the balance Luciano had built was gone. It was now a battlefield of ambition, everyone pretending to honor his legacy while carving up his kingdom. From his cell, he watched it all unfold through coded letters and whispered reports. He was still respected, but respect was a currency that depreciated fast. Power, he realized, only exists when you can touch it. Meanwhile, Dewey's star continued to rise. He became the hero of the decade, his name synonymous with law and order. He parlayed Luciano's conviction into political capital, eventually becoming governor of New York and even running for president. Luciano's name, meanwhile, became shorthand for organized evil. Mothers warned their children, you keep acting like that, and Lucky Luciano will come get you. It was myth-making at its finest. He had created an empire of criminals, and now, the world had turned him into a monster of legend. In prison, though, that legend didn't help. Winter came, cold and merciless. Luciano shoveled snow, cleaned floors, and organized illicit card games for guards who pretended not to notice. He began to age, slowly, imperceptibly at first. The sharp lines of his face hardened. The eyes, once electric with confidence, grew darker, more watchful. The arrogance was gone, replaced by calculation. If the world wanted to bury him, he would learn to breathe underground. He began corresponding secretly with Lansky and Costello through coded messages. On the surface, they discussed business, but between the lines lay strategy. Luciano was still giving orders, quietly, invisibly, turning prison into another office. He arranged for money to be funneled through unions, ensuring his allies were paid. He mediated disputes through intermediaries. The empire lived, even if its architect was confined to a cell. And yet, for all his composure, there were moments when the mask cracked. Late at night, when the lights dimmed and the prison went silent, Luciano would sit by his window, staring at the snow. "All that power," he once whispered to another inmate, "and it ends like this, cold and quiet." The man didn't respond. What could he say? Outside, the underworld moved on. The new generation of mobsters idolized him but didn't fear him. They quoted his rules but broke them when it suited them. The order he built was unraveling, replaced by chaos disguised as loyalty. He had once believed that structure could save the mafia from itself. Now he saw the truth: structure only lasts as long as men honor it, and men never do for long. In one rare interview aloud years later, a reporter asked him if he regretted anything. Luciano took a long drag of his cigarette and said, "Only one thing, I thought I could make wolves behave like businessmen. Turns out, they were just wolves in suits." The trial that had broken him became legend, studied in law schools and dramatized in pulp novels. Dewey was praised as the man who cleaned up the city. But history, ever ironic, would later reveal that Luciano's imprisonment did little to stop organized crime. The commission kept functioning. Money still flowed. Politicians were still bought. The machine didn't stop, it simply learned to operate without its creator. And in that lies the cruelest twist of all: Luciano had succeeded too well. He had built an empire so efficient that it no longer needed him. His arrest didn't destroy the mafia, it perfected it. When the lights went out each night in Dannemora, the other inmates slept. But Luciano lay awake, his mind turning over the same thought again and again, that he, Lucky Luciano, had become both the architect and the casualty of his own system. He had created order from chaos, loyalty from fear, business from blood. And in doing so, he had taught every man around him how to survive without him. It was the ultimate irony: the king had built the machine that replaced him. The trial had ended, the sentence delivered. But the true punishment wasn't the walls around him. It was the realization that his empire would live forever, and never again belong to him. The gates of Clinton prison closed, and Lucky Luciano vanished from the world he'd once ruled. The man who built the commission now slept on an iron cot and shoveled coal in the freezing dark. Yet even here, power found him. Within weeks, Luciano studied the routines, mapped the guards, and quietly began turning prison into a business. Cigarettes, food, protection, all ran through him. By year's end, the inmates called him boss. Even behind bars, he rebuilt order. But power couldn't silence memory. At night, he sat awake replaying the betrayal that ended him. The name he could never forget was Vito Genovese, the friend who'd fled to Italy just before the trial. "He knew what was coming," Luciano muttered. "He made his move before I did." Then came opportunity. During World War II, U.S. Navy officials sought his help to stop German sabotage on the New York docks, areas still loyal to his influence. From prison, Luciano restored order through his men. The docks ran smooth, the ships sailed safe. In secret, the U.S. government called it Operation Underworld, and Luciano had just traded loyalty for leverage. By 1946, Governor Dewey, the same man who convicted him, signed his release on one condition: deportation. When guards escorted him out, prisoners pounded the walls shouting his name. "Good luck, Lucky," someone yelled. Luciano smiled faintly, always had it. He walked free, but not victorious. Freedom meant exile. The empire remained, but America, the kingdom he'd built from the streets up, was gone. The king had been released from his cell only to find his throne missing. The ship docked in Naples, gray skies hanging low. Lucky Luciano stepped onto Italian soil for the first time in 40 years, not as a hero, but a ghost. He rented a small apartment overlooking the bay, watched ships come and go, and realized freedom had a new name: isolation. Italy treated him like a curiosity. Police shadowed his every move, phones were tapped, letters intercepted. He was the most watched man in Naples, an emperor without an empire. Still, instinct drove him to rebuild. Within months, he contacted Sicilian clans, French smugglers, and American allies, envisioning a new syndicate stretching from Europe to New York. The plan was bold, but age and mistrust slowed him. "I trusted too much in America," he said. "Over here, I trust no one." In 1947, Luciano sneaked into Cuba. For a brief moment, surrounded by Lansky and Costello, he felt alive again. Havana glittered, the laughter, the cigars, the illusion of control. But Washington pressured Cuba to deport him. Within weeks, he was back in Naples, older, watched, and tired. The years dulled him. He drank espresso by the sea, answering letters from young gangsters who called him Il Professor. "Power's a sickness," he'd warn them. "Once you taste it, you forget who you are." By 1960, he lived quietly in a small villa, more philosopher than mobster. The empire he built thrived without him, now colder, bloodier, less disciplined. "I made a machine," he said once. "And the machine don't need me anymore." He began meeting film producers to tell his story, one last bid to reclaim his truth. But fate was waiting for its final scene. January 26, 1962, Naples Airport. Lucky Luciano arrived early, dressed sharp, cigarette between his fingers. He was meeting Martin Gosch, a producer from America who wanted to make a film about his life. For the first time in years, Luciano looked hopeful. "They made up stories all my life," he said. "Now I get to tell mine." The two men talked for nearly an hour, about New York, betrayal, and the code that once ruled the underworld. Luciano spoke with rare warmth, laughing about his enemies. "Dewey did his job," he said. "Genovese did mine." As they stood to leave, Luciano buttoned his jacket, then froze. His hand went to his chest. The cigarette slipped from his fingers. He staggered, gasped once, and fell. By the time help arrived, the architect of the modern mafia was gone, a heart attack at 64. News spread fast. In Naples, it was a small headline. In New York, it was history. Men who had once feared him raised glasses in silent tribute, others whispered that even death had respected his timing. His funeral was simple, a few mourners, a priest, flowers sent anonymously from America. Later, his body was flown home to Queens. As they lowered the coffin, sunlight broke through the clouds. It was the first clear light of the day, like a spotlight closing on a stage. Lucky Luciano, the boy from the Lower East Side, the man who built the mafia, and the exile who outlived everyone, was gone. But his system, his shadow, his legend? Those would never die. Lucky Luciano's death didn't end his story, it began his legend. He was buried in Queens, beneath marble carved with his name, but his ideas lived on. The commission he built still ruled the underworld. Every mobster who came after him followed his blueprint: order over chaos, profit over pride. He had turned crime into a business, and business never dies. To some, he was the devil in a silk suit. To others, a visionary who civilized brutality. Historians called him the architect of organized power, a man who understood that fear could be managed like money. The trick, he once said, isn't making people scared of you, it's making them scared of losing you. But time rewrote his creation. The mafia he envisioned, disciplined, balanced, secret, became a battlefield of greed. His successors quoted his rules but ignored his restraint. The order he built collapsed under bullets and indictments. Even so, his design survived, in corporations, in politics, in cartels that copied his structure. The world had learned his lesson: power works best when it looks legitimate. Luciano had always believed he could control men the way he controlled systems. But people, unlike money, have memory. His downfall was the reflection of his own genius: he taught others too well. Betrayal, the same force that crowned him, destroyed him. In the end, his story became less about crime and more about truth, that every empire, legal or criminal, feeds on loyalty until loyalty breaks. He once told a friend, "Power's a chain, the tighter you hold it, the heavier it gets." Today, his ghost lingers wherever ambition meets corruption. And if the wind whispers his name through the alleys of New York, it says what history already knows: Lucky Luciano didn't die, he evolved.